Lee Blessing is one of our country's most prolific and distinguished playwrights. He was nominated in 1987 for a Tony Award and the Pulitzer Prize in Drama for his political drama, A Walk in the Woods. Mr. Blessing's career is nothing if not an illustrative path leading from London's West End to most of the major regional theaters in our country. He's the author of over 25 plays, including Thief River, Patient A, Independence, Eleemosynary, Nice People Dancing to Good Country Music, and Going to St. Ives. He is a winner of the Dramatists Guild, the Obie Award, the Olivier Award, the Outer Critics Award, the LA Drama Critics Award, the Great American Play Award, and the prestigious Humanitas Award. He's an extraordinary playwright and an outstanding educator. So would you welcome to the Kennedy Center, please, Lee Blessing. So I was at an elementary school a couple of weeks ago.
All right.
And talking to children. And in that innocent way, they asked, what is a playwright? And I found myself having to define for a 6-year-old what a playwright was. And that was a big challenge to me.
I imagine.
So I'm curious, if you had to answer that same question, what would you say?
Well, I think it's a fascinating question. I've been talking recently to the ACTF playwrights here at the ACTF Intensive, and I've been trying to differentiate for them what a playwright does and what a playwright is from what, say, someone who writes for television is, or someone who writes for film, other dramatic writers. And really, I think it has to do with the expectations of the audience in both cases. If you watch TV, you're watching in your home, you're sitting in your relaxa lounger, you've got your drink in your hand, you have your remote, you watch as much of any one thing as you wish, and you're utterly relaxed. Even going to a film, you're relatively relaxed. Nobody's watching to see when you come in or go out. It's easy to go to the bathroom if you want. You just kind of wander in and out, and you don't feel all that connected to the rest of the film audience. But if you go and see a play, comparatively, you're under a great deal of stress. You're leaving your home, you're driving into town, you're spending a lot of money on parking, on the restaurant. You're worried about making the curtain. Because you feel much more connected to the rest of the audience. You feel much more in public when you watch a play, sort of inevitably. And also because theater seats are tight, you're closer to them, I think. And you feel as though you're in a crowd with, everyone else has the flu, and there are all these intriguing aspects of stress. And after the show, they'll be saying, what did you think of it? So you're worried that you'll be tested as a critic as well. And because of that, I think audiences for theater are under much more stress, and their standards are therefore higher. If you're going to keep them for 2 hours, they're going to expect more. They're going to want to be thrilled. They're going to want to be fascinated. They're going to want to be compelled by the material. So I really think that when you're writing, especially a serious play, but even a comedy, what you experience is an audience who has high standards, and those standards rise every minute of the show. They expect the show not to be rangy, not to be digressive, to grab them and hold them all the way through. And the way you do that is you compel them. You make them deal with something inside themselves. You make them judge themselves and do that in a public context. So basically, I think a playwright, as opposed to some of these other kinds of artists and writers, is a person who first and foremost has to compel people. A playwright is someone who compels.
Politician, mathematician, weather person, playwright. Where does he or she function in the grand order of things? In the big scheme of things, what is their function?
Interesting. Well, a weatherman can tell you what the weather is, meteorologically speaking, what you're about to run into. I think often a playwright is someone who can tell you what you're running into in terms of the social zeitgeist, a kind of an atmosphere of human feelings that we all swim in as well, just as we swim in this ocean of air. I think a playwright is somebody who likes to climb the mast and look ahead of the ship and call down and give people a few insights about where he or she thinks the ship of state may be sailing. And whether or not you're writing an expressly political play, if you're writing a play about human beings in the here and now, it's always going to reflect what our social values are now, what our mores are, what we think is appropriate and inappropriate behavior, what we're willing to do and say to each other. And so, when a playwright shows us who we are, I think that's maybe the highest function they have. Obviously, it's always great to entertain people too, and keep them laughing and keep them scared and frightened and happy and fascinated all at the same time. But more than perhaps in other forms, a playwright is somebody who looks critically at society.
And is that their responsibility? I mean, is there a responsibility to do that, or is that just the art of it?
I think that's the role that they fill most effortlessly. I think that's what society, in a sense, can get from a playwright that it can't get anywhere else. Certainly, other people deal with criticizing society and analyzing society and all of that, but just as a novel allows us to explore the inner life of human beings in large social contexts. Or in private ones. Playwriting allows us to look at how people interact, what they do with each other, the way they handle each other, the way they handle, how those interior lives come into contact and into conflict. And we suddenly say, oh, that's how that guy does that. That's how he dominates this. What was David Hare's play, Stuff Happens, in which he imagines conversations between Bush and Powell and other members of the administration at the big run-up to the war in Iraq. Hare has these wonderful conversations that he admits, they're fictional conversations, and yet we watch them and believe them because we say, yeah, that's how he would have done it. That's how he would have gotten Powell to go out and do what he wanted to do, wanted him to do. It's showing us how we interact, how we get things done, how we manipulate each other and ourselves in situations.
And is that what drew you particularly into the art of writing plays, or did you fall into it? Were you pulled into it? What brought you to it?
I fell screaming into the abyss of playwriting. I started out in high school. I acted, so that was my interest in theater. And as far as writing goes, I started by writing stories, and then I ended up writing poetry. And I wrote a lot of poetry. I went to the University of Iowa Writers' Workshop as a graduate student in poetry, and published a lot of poems in little magazines and that sort of thing. Got a degree in that. Really, the playwriting just sort of developed as an undergrad, and then I started writing plays to get out of writing papers, actually. In theater courses. I said, well, could I just write it as a play? Well, yes. And the teacher would always say yes because he was looking forward to reading 30 theses, He's like, oh, at least one's a play, that'll be a relief. So I did that, and ultimately I got involved in writing plays. At Iowa, I got down there as a poet, and I realized that I couldn't fill out my schedule with just writing classes in the workshop because there weren't enough classes. So I realized I was in danger of taking scholarly courses. So to avoid that, of course, I went across the river and found the head of the graduate playwriting and said, I wrote a play. Can I be in your graduate program? And in 1974, he was free enough to say, sure, why not? He read my play. So yeah, come in. So they had a fire sale on positions for that program. And in that few years of writing both poetry and playwriting, I started to understand that sometimes your genre just picks you. While I was a very, more than competent poet, it was work to write a poem. It was a lot of cerebration and a lot of guesswork, and never feeling quite as though I was completely in command of the medium or the genre. And But when I started writing plays, writing dialogue felt utterly natural. And I suddenly realized that as a writer, I felt far more articulate in that form than in any other, more so than in prose. I'm not a great describer. And that's always what kicks people out of writing fiction. They're just tired of describing what color the wallpaper was, So it picked me, really.
Was there a time that, this is actually a two-part question. Is there a moment that you remember that you said, be it as a poet or as a playwright or any other kind of writer, that you said, I am a writer? And is there a moment where you went, I'm a playwright, that's what I am?
Well, actually, I remember the first time I published a poem in a significant little magazine. I had a poem published in Poetry Northwest, and that was a big thrill. I feel, that was you never forget that moment when some publisher who doesn't know you from Adam read your work and said, "Yeah, I want that one." It was astounding. It was delightful. When I was an undergrad at Reed College out in Portland, Oregon, I met a man named Robert Peterson, who's a wonderful poet who passed away about 8 years ago. And I would say that Robert really, I had been writing, but Robert taught me how to be a writer. He taught me, I learned from Robert what a writer's sensibility really is, why people write, what they're trying to do when they write. And he was a poet. And so I graduated with a poetry thesis, and I was writing poetry. And it wasn't until I got to, and I was writing bad plays at the same time, terrible plays. I'd been imitating the European existentialists, Beckett and Genet and UNESCO and all those guys, and Pinter, and I was really bad. But when I went to Iowa, I had written one play that was sort of a little different. Luckily, that's the one that was read there. And Oscar Brownstein, who headed that MFA program and later headed Yale's program, looked at my work and he said, I know you like all of these Grove Press guys, all of these playwrights from Europe, but you might reflect on the fact that unlike them, you are not somebody who lived through World War II and was wandering around a war-torn wreckage that was the European landscape in the late 40s, early 50s. And perhaps your heritage means that you should be reading other playwrights. And he suggested Tennessee Williams and William Inge and other Midwestern Americans, who I'd always thought, well, aren't they old-fashioned and boring? And I sat down and read them, and that really unlocked a lot of things for me as a playwright. And I started realizing that I can write about the people I knew, I grew up with, I lived among, with as much relevance, as any other. And I can hook into a literary tradition, which is much more legitimately mine than I'd been trying to. And so, in many ways, and also everything he had to teach about structure and the way plays are put together and why they're put together that way, really allowed me to become a playwright. So really, it was sort of two steps. With one mentor, I became a writer, and with the other, I became a playwright.
Was there a moment, though, that you, maybe the first time you heard a play read, the first time you finished a play, the first time you heard applause on your work, was there a moment as decisive as when that publisher said, I want to publish your poem? Was there a moment for you like that?
That's a good question. I'd acted a lot at Reed, but I didn't have anything done there in terms of plays. I got a grant from the Schubert Foundation to write plays right after I graduated from Reed. That was very, very nice, but it wasn't a thrill. At Iowa, we didn't really have that many stages, and you had to go and do your plays in church basements. I remember the first production I had of a particular script, and that was all fun, but no, not in the same way. I suppose the first show, well, I have an odd history. The first play I ever had done in New York was on Broadway, which was very unusual for someone of my generation.
And I would like to talk about that, Lee. How did that happen?
I'd have to say, if you're looking for that kind of a thrill, it was that.
Right,
it was
sure.
It was that production.
That was pretty extraordinary. Your first time into New York, to go write into Broadway?
It's extremely unusual, but I had been Minneapolis-based and had shows read at the O'Neill. That was a thrill, the first time I got to the O'Neill. And then also at Actors Theatre of Louisville. I'd had a couple of shows, 2 or 3 shows in their Humana Festival already. So, I was I had some visibility nationally as a playwright by that time. Not a lot, but some. And then I happened to write this play that got everybody excited in the East Coast establishment, and after the O'Neill reading, there were producers who said, I want to take this to Broadway. Then we did it out at La Jolla, and all of this kind of chugged along. The show set box office records both at Yale Rep and at La Jolla. Sort of on we went. It was just one of those things that it provided all of its own momentum. It just happened to be the right play for the right time. And we went into New York, and then later the same year, it opened in London with, in New York, it was Sam Waterston and Robert Prosky, a 2-man play. And in London, it was Sir Alec Guinness and Edward Herrmann. So it was, and all of this happened within, the period of a year. That was really quite a thrill. It was a great ride. I think, every playwright should have the chance to have a show on Broadway because it's so amusing in so many ways and so bizarre in many ways. And it's sort of like going to a different planet. And the show was a success to steam everywhere it was done, and I was very pleased by that. But I never aimed at being a Broadway playwright. I never thought it was a very serious aim for a serious American playwright. It just doesn't happen enough. The commercial necessities of Broadway just don't make that happen very much. Because they have to look for musicals, they have to look for comedies, and they have to look for plays from the British Isles, primarily. So Americans don't usually have that open to them. The second production I had in New York was at Manhattan Theatre Club. So, and as I like to tell people, I've been working my way downtown ever since, So by now I've been done at every level in New York, but at that time it was very new.
And was that process of being on Broadway first and then working your way downtown, which is quite the opposite of what I think most people's journeys are. They start downtown and work their way up.
Absolutely.
Did that mean anything to you? Was that difficult for you? Was that an okay thing for you? Because what I heard you say is that you never actually quite intended to be on Broadway to begin with.
No, my ambition was, well, maybe, significant off-Broadway, because that's sort of where the economics work for
Right.
serious new work. And the economics have been tougher and tougher, actually. But still, the big subscription houses like Manhattan Theatre Club, Lincoln Center, Playwrights Horizon, Second Stage, are, I think, sort of the highest natural ambition of serious playwrights in this country, because those places, not that they necessarily always do better productions, but those are the ones that the media covers. The publicity still comes out of New York, primarily. So that's where a playwright ideally, gets a big production. So yeah, that simply happened to be the height of my ambition at the time. Broadway was it was just a bonus.
And I think you're the kind of writer that actually just writes the play, and wherever it finds its place is where it finds its place. Is that a right assessment or a wrong assessment?
No, I think that's absolutely right. In a way, looking back on my career, unfortunately I'm at that point, in my career where I can look back on it. I kind of sit there and realize that in America, the game is hits. You don't really get many points just for writing consistently at a high level for many years.
And yet you've been writing for 25 years?
Yeah, hardly. It's early 80s. 81, I think, is the first time I had a show produced. You don't get that many brownie points for that. What you get points for are hits. And then you can live off them a long time, just in terms of your reputation. There are playwrights who won the Pulitzer Prize 30 years ago and have written about 2 good plays, and yet, in a sense, they're quite well known. And they're going to continue to be quite well known because they sort of won those things at a certain time, and they had hits. And I don't think I've ever had a huge commercial hit in New York. I've had critical hits at regular intervals.
A Walk in the Woods was not a big...
Oh, no, it didn't make its money back.
Oh, right.
It's on Broadway, it's expensive, But I have to remind people now that that's true. which is great. I suppose that's almost as good. You know, I've just had a different journey than a lot of other playwrights who've been in it for a long time and feel within the business at least quite successful and quite well rewarded in terms of productions. And now I get shows done, and I open shows at all different kinds of levels of theater. You know, all the way from, well, you know, a couple of springs ago I had Going to St. Ives done at Primary Stages, which is sort of a second-tier off-Broadway subscription house, you know, which has been doing some very good productions and some very good writers, including Terry McNally and Horton Foote and people like that. But on Friday, this last week, I opened a world premiere to a new play in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, at the Contemporary American Theater Festival, which is a relatively small regional house that.
But that does a lot of work,
a
lot of original work every summer.
Oh, yes, they do. Well, my play is the only world premiere they're doing. One of the nice things about them is that they also do second and third productions of plays. So they're not, you know, they don't have world premiere-itis, you know, either. But what I love about them is they'll do my most disturbing political work. You know, the stuff that sort of advertises, I am not commercial, they will do. And we have a good, strong, loyal relationship, you know, Ed Herendeen, the artistic director, and I. So, you know, I might start a play there. I might start a play, you know, somewhere. I started a play at the Guthrie Theater a couple of years ago. So I don't always know where it's all going to happen, but I write a play fully in the faith that someone will do it and someone will want to do it again sometime. I also have plays that I wrote 20 years ago that are getting more productions now than they did then. A play called Two Rooms, which is about the Middle East. It's about an American being kidnapped in the Middle East. After 9/11, suddenly started getting twice or three times as many productions as it had been getting. So I try to write plays that, you know, I'll get done and I'm not too worried about whether they'll be hits, but I'd like them to have lives, you know, and be interesting enough for somebody to do 10 years from now. And I'm very proud of the fact that a lot of my plays get done continuously and have been, you know, for 25 years.
I want to talk about, I know you made a joke about looking back on your career, but there is something extraordinary in this day and age about anyone who's had a career that's been sustained over 20 years, 10 years, 20, 25, or whatever it happens to be. So from when you came into it to where we are today, what have you seen change in the landscape?
Oh, well, a lot of things have changed. And in a way, I'm sort of an oddity, you know, because no one's supposed to be in this business for 25 years without having a number of hits that have made them a household name, at least within the business. You know, you're supposed instead to get a couple of hits and then go out to Hollywood and get into TV where you can make some real money. So I should probably be wearing a dunce cap during this interview because I never really did that terribly successfully. And a lot of playwrights, who are wonderful playwrights, sort of never went that route. I think of Lanford Wilson, you know, somebody that just was never comfortable writing in those media. But it's hard to make a living as a playwright, even if you're getting done a lot. You know, if I only lived on what I made as a playwright, I think I'd sort of have to live in a log in Maine somewhere, you know, in order to make ends meet. So I also run a graduate program, a playwriting program at Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers. I used to also write a little more television and film. You know, I had to find other forms of income. Other income streams to make ends meet. The business itself, I think, is more difficult to enter. I think it's more difficult to stay in it because of these economic pressures. The pressures have only grown on playwrights during my career. And it's sort of unfortunate because everybody is feeling economic pressure in the theater, and so what they do is tend to transfer it wherever they can. And get it off them. So a lot of theaters that are wonderful partners for new playwrights at the same time have started, well, dunning playwrights. They sort of have imposed a tax on playwrights. If you want your new play done at our theater, then you're going to have to sign a contract which gives us 3, 5, or more % of everything you earn on that play forever. You know, I mean, and that's sort of become an industry standard since, during the time that I became a playwright, basically in the 70s and 80s, it started to become more standardized around the country. And this only occurs because playwrights don't have a union. We're barred by law from having a union, so we have no collective negotiating power. And people realized that, and they said, well, you know, we can just make them do it. And so they do that. And, you know, in a sense, theaters need money too, and they're always under pressure, and I can understand why they're looking for other ways to get income. But frankly, you know, I worry that it's cutting their nose off to spite their face, because it just puts more pressure on playwrights. And makes more people say, why aren't I in a different field? And some of the best and most talented playwrights tend to go, well, I could stay in theater, but why? There's no money. You know, so they go out to LA and they work in another field. Some of them run major shows and have gotten quite wealthy. Not that it bothers me. That's changed a bit. And the other thing I noticed, that tendency of other aspects or other areas of theater looking at playwrights as, ooh, we can get some of those royalties if we just do that. Now I stumble into directors who are doing the same thing. There are a few directors on Broadway. Broadway has developed this star system of directors. You know, you're trying to raise money from backers, produce a show on Broadway, you know, a lot of economic pressure there. And suddenly they want to be able to say, it's going to be directed by so-and-so, or so-and-so, or so-and-so. You know him, he directs on Broadway. And, you know, he may be a wonderful, or she may be, I think there are very few women in this group, might be a wonderful director, and that's fine, but there's probably another wonderful director that's never had the chance, because now there's sort of a set group of these people that you'll notice their names over and over and again in, you know, directing shows on Broadway. And guess what? Their agents come to our agents and they say, you know, if you want so-and-so directing your play, he's going to want X% of your royalties from this production forever. You know, everybody's figuring out that playwrights can't defend themselves economically from this. It's either, you know, either you give it or you don't get the production, or you don't get the director, and they're relying on getting the director to get the backers, and on and on and on. So one of the most depressing you know, changes in theater in the last 25 years has been this sense that nobody needs to have any loyalty to the playwright. They'll do your show, but they want to do your show because it's a good show, because they think they can make money on it. And they'll turn right around and, with, you know, without any sense of gratitude about that, they'll say, oh, and by the way, you need to earn less on this. And, you know, and forgetting that it takes a year or 2 years to write a play. And that's all your income, you know. The director will work on 4 or 5 things that year or more. A designer might work on a dozen projects in a year. A playwright is lucky to get 1. And you got to make all your money from that. So that's my rant. I'm sorry.
Has the process of how you create plays changed over the 25 years that you've been writing? In other words, dictated in part by where you know it's eventually going to go or not? Or do you just write your play in the way you've always written your play and it will find its way?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's more the latter. I write whatever play occurs to me to write. And I don't sit there and second guess myself and ask, is it a commercial idea? Is it terribly topical? Is it something that's going to get all the literary managers and artistic directors around the country to be all aquiver because it's just the right hot button topic? I write about what's important to me, and I also like to explore when I write. So, you know, if I have a reputation, it's that I write plays that are not always very much like each other. This is another commercial no-no. You know, people like a playwright's name to become a label or a shingle. You know what kind of a play you're going to. You think, if it's an August Wilson play, or a Neil Simon play, or a Wendy Wasserstein play, you have a sense that, you know, they kind of, and you know, it's no criticism of any of them. They write in a relatively narrow vein, but they write very deeply into that vein. I simply approach it a different way, and that's easier to market. The way I approach it is, this is interesting, I'm going to try this, or I've never done one of those, or I've never done something like that, or you know, what if I really change things around here? And while there are, you know, certainly some things I've done again and again, for the most part, you can't tell from what I've written what I'm about to write. And for that reason, I can't tell where it's about to go. I can't tell necessarily what theater is going to want to do it. But it might very well be a very different theater than the last one that wanted to do it.
So when you wrote A Walk in the Woods, for example, and it was at the O'Neill, were you surprised that somebody said, I want to take that into New York and take that to Broadway? Could that have been any of your plays that happened to?
Oh, no,
Or-
not at all.
Right.
No, a play that happens to is a very unusual play that happens to kind of hit the zeitgeist at the right moment, and it is simply that thing everybody's already thinking about and needs to see a play about. There have been a lot of plays about the Middle East since 9/11, oddly enough, for very good reasons. People want to explore it, and they want to explore it viscerally, which is what drama can do for you. So people have been doing that. In the mid-'80s, I think I started in '85, everybody was worried about the Cold War. They were worried that Ronald Reagan was rattling the sabers and talking about Star Wars and calling the USSR the evil empire at a time when the USSR had many, many megatons of missiles aimed right at us, and we were depending on their fail-safe systems and all their rusty technology not to have an accident. So people were quite worried, and we were running to the New York Times to see how talks were going in Geneva, about all that. So it seemed to be potentially a rich topic once I conceived of the play, and I thought, well, I got to write that. It'll be nice and it'll be fun. I've never written a two-man. I had written a two-person full-length before that. In fact, now I've written 5 of them. And let's give that a shot. And I'd been to the Soviet Union in 1971 as a student. I'd made friends there, which surprised me because as a Cold War kid, I was under the impression that I couldn't make friends with a Russian. So there were a lot of things I learned about that and that I could put into this play, and make the Russian more charming than the American, for example, which was the first surprise for audiences. But people saw that, they saw that script, they heard that play. The first time it was ever read was on July 4th at the O'Neill, outside, and in Waterford, Connecticut, which is about 5 miles from a major nuclear submarine base in New London. And in fact, at that time, George would have Russians come over, Russian artists, and of course they were always accompanied by KGB guys. And I remember standing on the porch of the mansion at the O'Neill, staring out over Long Island Sound and watching nuclear submarines run out into the Sound from the river, standing next to a couple of KGB guys who were looking on it with very great interest, as I recall. So it was really on people's minds, and because of that, I think someone said, oh, look at this, a 2-person single set show. We can throw this onto Broadway, and it's what everybody wants to think about now. And there you've got an audience. There was nobody in the world that didn't worry about nuclear war. So you figure you've got a huge potential audience.
So that when you wrote another 2-character play between women, did you think the same thing was going to happen? This would be...
Going to St. Ives?
Right. I don't want to... Exactly.
Yeah.
Which actually I think you've talked about the parallels between those.
Oh, very much so. In fact, they were conscious. When I was at the O'Neill in '86 with the play, with A Walk in the Woods, 2 actresses who were in the company, who were around the same ages as the men who were doing the play, said, you really should write a play like that for women. And I said, you guys are wonderful actresses, and I'll get right on it. So 10 years later, when they were far too old to be on, I did write a play. It turned out, of course, to be very different because, for all sorts of things. But I wanted to write a geopolitical play on a somewhat humbler scale, as it turned out, using 2 women and their reactions to things, what they were doing. And that play also became about sort of an eternal question that if you are very close to a megalomaniac, if you are Hitler's mother, if you are Pol Pot's brother or sister, and you see what they're doing, why don't you do anything about it? And of course people don't, or Caligula would have been stopped, and long before it got that bad. So I posited an Idi Amin-like dictator in an unnamed sub-Saharan African country, and created his mother. So he's not in it, but his mother has an eye problem, goes to England to deal with it, finds a doctor, and starts talking to the doctor about getting some poison to take care of her son. And this is, in the play, he takes it quite seriously, and it deals with what she has to go through emotionally to kill her son. But what I liked about it, and I really, when I started thinking about that play, I said, where should she be from, this mother of this dictator? What part of the world? And I thought about South America or Southeast Asia or Africa or any of them. And I realized that if it's in Africa, then the person she's talking to is like an English person, and all of that colonial baggage can come into the play, which was, I think, very helpful to the play and kept it political and not just personal. So it became its own play. But I remember when we had it at the O'Neill, Lloyd said, maybe you should call it A Walk in the Garden instead of going to St. Ives. It really emphasized the parallelism to the first play. And I said, nah, I'm not going to do that. But I was glad he found it that similar in certain ways.
You have said, and I just want to make sure I get this quoted correctly, that Broadway has turned into a real estate scam and a theme park. I'm just wondering where that comes from, what your thoughts are there.
Well, there goes my next Broadway production, I guess. No. I think it's inevitable, again, given the economics surrounding something like Broadway, that ultimately, the economic forces are so powerful that nobody can make the furtherance of a dramatic literature tradition their highest priority when they're making decisions about what to do on Broadway or how to handle Broadway, how to advertise Broadway. Broadway remains one of the few economically feasible places that you can do a new play. Unfortunately, they tend to not do that many American plays, new American plays. They have pressures like anybody else. Broadway houses are sort of a fixed size. They can't make new seats. They can't put more seats in there. It's not like sports arenas where you can just tear it down and put it up a different way and put in a lot of luxury boxes and charge through the roof. These buildings are on the historical registry. You just can't mess with them that way. Even if you wanted to. So they know that they sort of have and also you can't raise ticket prices that precipitously. So they've been going up, and people have noticed that, and they complain, just as they complain about gas prices, but they still pay them, and they still go if a show's a hit. And now Young Frankenstein's going to come up, and they're going to say, okay, now the very best seats we're going to sell for like $450. I bet they can go out and find people who will pay that, and people will go and say, well, we're sitting the very best seats. Well, all right. So it is sort of crazy, and what they've discovered is that the shows they can feel most confident putting out there are the musicals, the sort of the Disney-backed musicals, the things that are for a very broad audience, the Wickeds, which apparently every 13-year-old girl from Long Island is required to see 7 times. They have worked out, we could do something that furthers American dramatic literature, or we could do the play that every 13-year-old girl from Long Island has to see 7 times. And let's work that out, and of course, the American tradition of theater is commercial. So, that's the top thing. It means that on Broadway, the preponderance of plays has gotten softer and softer, blander and blander, less and less challenging, which of course for a playwright like me is simply not interesting. They do a lot of musicals. They do very little of the classics on Broadway anymore. They certainly do very few new American plays. Every once in a while there's a hit, like Proof or Doubt or one of those, and that sort of gives the lie to this complaint, but it's really the exception that proves the rule, I think. It's too bad, but this is a country that doesn't have a national theater. It doesn't have major funding for the arts compared to other developed countries from the federal point of view. The government just doesn't want to do that, and you can't get enough people in America to get behind it. It's too bad. I think it'd be far more beneficial than working out the next weapons system and paying for that. But I'm not in charge, So playwrights just work with what they've got. one of the good things is we've also, in the last 50 years, developed a tremendous regional theater system. A lot of those theaters are under pressure, and they don't always choose the most challenging seasons, but a lot of them try. And a lot of the people out there would be programming more challenging work if they felt they could get away with it economically.
If Broadway reflects a certain appetite in the theater, and regional theaters have to reflect that on some level, so that they also can draw their audiences in, where is the important theater being made? Is it still in the regional theaters, or do you have to actually go even beyond them?
Well, I think it's being made all over the place, and it's in a highly unpredictable way. I just had a terrific opening of a play I'm very proud of in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, in a 150-seat house that's going to have, I think, 16 performances. So you do the math. One performance on Broadway draws more people than will see my play in this production. And I hope it gets other productions and it gets published and other people do it. But, you sort of have to be a real aficionado to know where it's happening and to follow the writers that I think are ambitious and doing interesting work. That's one of the problems in this country. We're not terribly good at getting the word out. And we're not terribly good at, in the popular culture, at making people aware of and keeping them aware of why theater is important, where important theater happens to be getting done. Theater's always been around, and it probably always will be, but it's always changing because it's always economically threatened. So it's always having to, like Phoenix, reinvent itself and be reborn. Theaters like Théâtre de la Jeune in Minneapolis, I can say that, simply grow up on their own. They're a little company that sort of creates itself, and there it is. And if you're smart, you go over and see what they're doing because it's interesting. And various cities have these things kind of happen. Austin, Texas is a lot of fascinating work that gets done there. And these are centers of theatrical energy. I think sometimes in New York, the people who run all the commercial, the Broadway and the commercial stuff, are notably lousy at waking Americans up to other alternatives in theater. They just want you to come in and think that Wicked is the end all and be all. And I don't hate that show. I haven't seen that show, but it's a very commercial idea, as is Legally Blonde on Broadway, and that sort of thing. And you just sort of wish, just as you wish the Hollywood studios that make the very unchallenging movies for millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, would help us understand that there are some other very good movies that we should be seeing, But there's always this huge gap between what's terribly popular economically and what's really actually good for people and interesting and will help them grow.
I have a final question for you. I think it starts with an opinion and then a question. I think you are a playwright's playwright for many, many reasons, a lot of which we talked about today. Who do you think who is a playwright's playwright to you? It's always difficult. Various versions of this question, which always in my mind instantly boil down to who do I admire. Or who's your hero? Or
I teach a course at Rutgers where we have to do 30 plays from the last 2,500 years, and I get to pick them. So they're all my heroes. And my problem is that when I pick one, there's a million that I could pick, so I love all sorts of writers, and right now, for some reason, I just thought of 3 British writers. I don't know why. There are a lot of amazing American writers. But Tom Stoppard is always a hero of mine. Martin McDonagh, I think, did this astounding thing in 1 year, apparently. He wrote 7 amazing plays and completely updated J.M. Singh. Sarah Kane, who wrote some of the most disturbing plays I've ever read and then killed herself. August Wilson, who was a friend of mine and I think just created an absolutely amazing body of work in a mere 20 years and something that is a major American artifact. Tony Kushner is a writer I'm always fascinated to read, and I could go on and name 50 people, and my wife, Melanie Marnich, is my hero.
Right on.
A fabulous writer in her own right.
She certainly is. Thanks, Lee.
You bet, thank you.